the dust spreading and settling through the streets of Manhattan, eventually engulfing the whole of Manhattan. Manhattan has now been as good as sealed off. All bridges, all tunnels are closed, the airports are closed. People are being asked by the emergency services to conserve water in anticipation of a shortage over the coming days. The emergency services are, of course, under traumatic strain as all the hospitals fill up with the casualties. There are no definite reports yet of any figures, but we do know that 50,000 people work 5 days a week in the Twin Towers in New York. We heard from one of those people, a woman on the 56th floor, who said that she believed that the plane had crashed into the 67th floor. She managed to make it down amid the scenes of chaos. She said people battling for their lives to get out of the doors and onto the streets of Manhattan. Now, can I just remind you that if you were hoping to see children's ITV, those programmes are on now on ITV2. We're staying on the air here on ITV1 with the latest on the terrible events unfolding in the United States. We're seeing there pictures live from Washington, D.C. of the Pentagon. One part of the Pentagon has collapsed and is on fire and is being treated by the tenders there. And we see, of course, the bewildered citizens of Washington, D.C. wondering literally what has hit them and what to make of these of this appalling situation. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Dr. Andrew Ruthnell, who I spoke to earlier on the phone. You're a terrorism analyst, a terrorism specialist. We would never expect to see scenes like this. You maybe are in a better position than most to make some sort of sense of them. Tell us what you think.
Well, even for someone who's been looking at terrorism for a while, those engaged in the terrorism field, this is the real nightmare scenario. This was the scenario, the terrorist spectacular, we thought would never really happen, and was really, it's what the US security services and Pentagon have been planning for many years, but even they never thought anything as coordinated as this would take place. On the other hand, of course, it's not utterly unprecedented, because some of the groups which were involved in trying to destroy the World Trade Center almost 10 years ago now, in 1993, did try to launch a very similar sort of attack in the 1990s, coordinated planes crashing into targets. They were foiled, but as the IRA have said, terrorists only need to be lucky once. So there was a precedent for this, and it's quite clear that some of the Middle Eastern Islamist terrorist groups have been trying to pull this sort of spectacular off for several years, and evidently they succeeded today.
Can you give us some sort of idea of the coordination that goes into an attack like this? Because one single attack on the scale, one individual attack, would itself seem to mean that there would be months, if not even years, of planning to hijack an aircraft, to coordinate yourself and the airlines and plan on the particular target that you wanted to bring down. Something like this, though, where we're talking about potentially 5 or maybe even 6 different targets, what kind of planning?
Tremendous, and more than we've seen with any terrorist operation before. We've seen in the past, on a very limited scale in the UK, how the provisional IRA, when they were carrying out terrorism, managed to carry out coordinated attacks on motorways, on the rail system, and that took them a tremendous amount of resources and planning, and that, of course, is nothing compared to this. Certainly what we've seen when we had the World Trade Center attack in '93, that took months and months of preparation and planning just to launch one bomb attack on the World Trade Center. So what we're seeing here is something which has clearly been planned for many years.
But Dr. Ruthnell, does this give us any indication of the sort of group that must be capable of it? Because surely the sort of money, the sort of time, the network of contacts to put together an operation such as this must be enormous, and therefore it must narrow down the amount of people who
Absolutely.
are capable of it.
There's very few groups that could have been behind this, and which is why attention is now focusing on some of the Islamist groups that are linked to Osama bin Laden, based in Afghanistan, but also operating throughout the Middle East, throughout America. This is a loose collection of groups, but they have a lot of very capable people, planners, technicians, bomb makers.
It's interesting. We are just hearing that the Taliban government in Afghanistan have said that they are due to give a press conference shortly. What do you make of that?
Well, it's very interesting, given that, of course, this has been one of the main bones of contention between the US government and the Taliban the last few years. The fact that the Taliban have allowed Osama bin Laden and his groups to operate freely in their country. They've been under strong pressure from the US to give them up. Up until now, they've been reluctant to do that. It may well be that in this case they feel that bin Laden, if he was behind this, has overstepped the mark, and they need to actually limit the damage to themselves now, because the US will clearly retaliate to this.
For now, thank you very much. Please do stay with us. Let's join Jo Andrews live from Downing Street. She's on the line. Jo Andrews, we heard a short statement from Tony Blair at the TUC conference. in Brighton. What do we know of Mr. Blair's movements now?
Well, he's obviously cut short that trip to Brighton. He's on his way back to London. We expect him to arrive back here at Downing Street in the next half hour or so. He'll go straight into a meeting of what's called COBRA, which is the Emergency Planning Committee of the Cabinet. At that meeting, there will be the military and the security chiefs, Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, Gordon Brown, and anyone else, Jeff Hoon, the Defence Secretary. They will review the emergency planning procedures for Britain. What we know at the moment is that the state of awareness at all government buildings and all military installations has already been raised. That happened about half an hour or so after we saw the first plane go into the towers in New York. At the moment, none of the government buildings here have actually been evacuated.
Is there any evidence, as you can see it at face value, of this increase in security, Joe, on the streets of London?
You can certainly see it around here in the government buildings. They wanted to have a look at our passes and said they weren't good enough when we actually went in to talk to the Foreign Secretary. He called this a crime, an attack on civilization, and he spoke of giving all the help that Britain could to America to help them find the people behind this and bring them to justice.
Joe Andrews, for now, thank you for joining us. Let's once again speak to Dr. Andrew Rathmell, who's an analyst in terrorism. This is a strike at the very heart of what we regard as the free world. The targets have been clearly chosen very carefully.
Absolutely. This is, as you say, the heart of the free world, the heart of Wall Street, the symbol of American power. Pentagon, the State Department are the other symbols. If any other targets are attacked or are targeted, they're likely to be similar sorts of symbols. These, frankly, are the symbols to Islamists in the Middle East, and indeed to many Palestinians, of American power, American arrogance, American imperialism. And frankly, they will be rejoicing in the streets of many Middle Eastern countries tonight.
Can you explain to me, with the knowledge you have, James Mates touched on the fact that the plane in Washington, D.C. was not flown into the White House. Can you explain the security that surrounds the White House and why these terrorists would have known that that was a bad target?
Around the White House in particular, but also around other targets such as the Pentagon, the Secret Service does have anti-aircraft measures in place. For example, Secret Service agents do have anti-aircraft missiles, such as Stinger missiles, of the sort of missiles that were used by the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s. They're always in place. Clearly, after the first attacks in New York, they have set up their alert, and they have been quite willing and able to shoot down any planes which didn't answer FAA requests, which didn't comply with the flight plan. So it's been quite clear to the terrorists that if they had actually targeted the White House, there'd been a good chance of the plane never actually making it there. And I think the terrorists would have known that. That's public knowledge.
Why then would there not be the same security operation precautions, call it what you like, in place at somewhere like the Pentagon? Well,
the Pentagon there is. The Pentagon, though, has a real problem in the sense the Pentagon is almost next to National Airport. It's very close to National Airport, which is the local airport for Washington, in which there is obviously a lot of traffic. Now, we're not quite sure what route the plane took. It's obviously very hard for the Pentagon to shut down or order the shutdown of traffic into National Airport at very short notice. And certainly what it doesn't want to do is accidentally fire on any civilian aircraft which may be in the area. So that may well have been a loophole, we don't know, but that may well have been a loophole that the terrorists exploited. This confusion over whether they were actually a civilian airliner or in fact a hijacked airliner.
Can you explain to us a little bit more about the path that the terrorists might have taken to pick the aircrafts that they were going to hijack? Because in a sort of off-the-cuff analysis, and you excuse my ignorance on this subject, I was wondering whether or not flying from Boston Airport, which is not so far in air miles terms from New York, they had picked an airport that was close by in order that the American military didn't have time to work out their plan and enforce it.
Well, that's certainly true, but there is a broader point which I know is now being reviewed in the US, which is that internal aviation in the US is not secure. It's unlike flying within Europe or internationally. The nature of the market is that you can walk onto a plane generally. You generally do not have to have your baggage x-rayed. So it's been known for some time, and the Pentagon has been worried about this, that internal security on US domestic flights is very poor. Boston is not particularly poor. Other airports are even worse. So first of all, there's this huge vulnerability in the American aviation system. Secondly is the question of, if you like, your flight time. And clearly, I think it's fairly clear that the shorter your flight time with a hijacked airplane, the less time you have of being intercepted or discovered.
I mentioned that we're expecting a press conference in Afghanistan. People naturally are consumed with the day-to-day news as they see it and do not always read the foreign pages of their newspaper and might only remember the history only vaguely. Can you put into some sort of context for us briefly the relationship between the Mujahideen, Afghanistan and the US government?
Well, let's remember though that the group which may be responsible for this, we obviously don't know yet,
yes.
the group linked to Osama bin Laden, is not at heart an Afghan group. It's an Islamic group which has links in the US, in the UK, in France, all over the Middle East. And although some of the members are Afghani, others are Saudi, Egyptian, Palestinian. So it's very much a multinational conglomerate. They happen at the moment of the last few years to have found a conducive home in Afghanistan for two reasons. Partly because Afghanistan is still at war with itself. There's still a civil war in Afghanistan, and that provides a very fertile recruiting and training ground for these Mujahideen. But secondly, of course, the current government over most of Afghanistan, the Taliban, is not recognized by most Western governments. Ideologically, it is opposed both to Zionism and to what they call Western imperialism, and therefore, unsurprisingly, it supports the general ideological aims of Osama bin Laden to oppose Western influence and to improve the position of Muslims around the world. So there are some links, obviously, between bin Laden and the Taliban government.
We heard from our correspondent in Israel that Osama bin Laden had denied any involvement with this attack. Are we to trust his denial, or should we be sceptical?
No, I think we should be sceptical, but cautiously sceptical. There has been a trend in the last few years of terrorist acts, particularly mass terrorism. We just have to remember Lockerbie, where no group claims responsibility, and this has been a change since the 1970s. So we may well find that with this operation, there may well be claims of responsibility, but the real people behind this may not actually want to admit to it because they know they'll be punished by the US and by its allies. Even if Osama bin Laden himself was not involved in this, that's not the way his group works. His group is a very loose network. It's not a hierarchy. It's a very loose, fragmented network, and although he may have had some knowledge of this in general terms, the people who actually, his lieutenants who might have carried out this sort of operation wouldn't necessarily have filled him in on the details. So it could well be the case that he didn't know the details of this, even if some of his colleagues were carrying it out.
For now, Dr. Andrew Rathmell, an analyst in terrorism, thank you very much for your expertise. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go now live to Helen Wright in the newsroom. After you hear from Helen, my colleague Dermot Murnaghan will be joining you.
Well, let me tell you the latest information I have from the States. I'm now told that the United States of America is on a coast-to-coast state of alert and that the President and his senior advisors are meeting. They've set up what they call a situation room in the White House where these attacks in New York and Washington are now being discussed. The Mayor of New York has warned that a tremendous number of lives have been lost in these attacks. We're now fearing that thousands of people have been killed. I have some new information on the second plane that was involved in the attack on the World Trade Center towers. The first one believed to be a Boeing 767 flying from Boston to Los Angeles. The second one, we believe, was a plane flown out of Newark, of course not terribly far from Manhattan. Let me tell you a little bit now about the wider implications. Here in London, Canary Wharf has been evacuated, the NatWest Tower has been evacuated, Lloyd's of London and the London Stock Exchange have been evacuated, and of course in New York the financial markets have closed down indefinitely. Obviously the situation in New York is having a tremendous knock-on effect for international air travel. Flights from France to the US have been cancelled. Flights from Germany have been halted. Alitalia has recalled flights that were en route to the US. And all Virgin flights, I've told, have now been recalled. All Virgin flights that were en route to the US have been recalled in response to events in New York and Washington today. I'm also just being told that Israel has said it's withdrawing its diplomats from the US. So the latest information, a coast-to-coast state of alert in America, knock-on implications worldwide, with major financial centres in London being evacuated and huge implications for international air travel, though of course that is not foremost in our minds this afternoon when we fear that so many people will have died in these incidents in the United States.
That, Helen Wright, as you say, an event with global ramifications, and thanks also to my colleague Kirsty Young for talking us through the early hours of this devastating attack on the United States of America. Let's look back now over the terrible events and dramatic pictures of the last 3 hours. One plane had already hit the World Trade Center in New York when news crews scrambled and began filming the smoke and flames pouring out from one of the Twin Towers. While they were filming, a second plane, there we see it, crashed into the other tower. That set off a huge explosion and resulting fire. Shortly after that, there was a third attack. This one was not in New York, but in the heart of America, Washington, D.C., on the Pentagon buildings, the headquarters of the U.S. military and intelligence services. Fire crews were quickly on the scene there to try to cope with the flames. Then, back in New York, we can see here pictures of the collapse of one of the towers, the first of the towers of the World Trade Center, with huge clouds of dust engulfing much of central and lower Manhattan. Then came the collapse, the dramatic collapse of the second tower of the World Trade Center, changing forever the New York skyline. One of its most famous landmarks, gone for good. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center have been destroyed in a terrorist attack. There you can see the dust, the clouds of dust, hundreds of feet high, engulfing New York. One can only imagine what it was like there for people on the ground. Inevitably, people would have gathered to have watched and witnessed that scene, pushed back by the fire crews and police. But those clouds of smoke and dust engulfing much of Manhattan. As we say, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center have collapsed after being hit by two hijacked passenger aircraft. One took off from Boston on its way to Los Angeles. A Boeing 767 crashed into one of the towers. The other tower was hit, we believe, by a Boeing 737, one a United Airlines plane, the other an American Airlines plane. No British airliners involved in that. These pictures we have, as you can see, were taken earlier, but not that much earlier. This all happened just about an hour ago, the collapse of the towers. It was just shortly before 2 o'clock our time, early in the morning in the United States, just before 9 o'clock in Manhattan, when those attacks took place. These are, now we're cutting to those live pictures of New York, and look at the pall of smoke and dust that has engulfed the entire parts of Manhattan. That's a mixture of the fires still burning around the remains of the World Trade Center down in lower Manhattan, dust from the huge towers. We've got to imagine how tall those buildings were, how much dust and debris and rubble that has been thrown up, and we can only imagine at this moment how many people have perished in this attack. Also an attack as well in Washington, D.C., where we're going now to join our correspondent there, James Mates. James, behind you, of course, the burning Pentagon. What can you tell us from there?
It's difficult to establish exactly what happened here, except that eyewitnesses do say that an aircraft crashed into the Pentagon. You can see the smoke still rising from over there behind me. Crashed initially into a helicopter landing pad and then struck the building. There has been a major fire there. Part of the Pentagon has collapsed. Now, beyond that, we don't have any details. It's not clear what the aircraft was or where it was coming from. We do know that two American Airlines jets have been involved in today's incidents. One was flying from Boston to Los Angeles. The other was flying from here in Washington to Los Angeles. It may be significant that they were both big jets, would both have been very full of fuel before starting that cross-country journey across to the West Coast. We know that both those aircraft have been lost. American Airlines have reported that. It's not clear whether they are both the ones that went into the World Trade Center or not. There is another air crash southeast of Pittsburgh. That, we are told, is a 747 jumbo jet operated by United Airlines on its way to Chicago, I understand. Now, those three jets are confirmed missing. Whether there is a fourth one involved here at the Pentagon is still not absolutely clear. But it looks like it.
I just say for our audience here that we're expecting a statement very shortly, another statement from the Prime Minister, Tony Blair. He's already spoken on the issue at the TUC conference in Brighton. We are expecting another statement shortly, as I say. Now, James Mates in Washington, what about the President? He, of course, is crucial in all this, in the coordination of dealing with this. We saw him speak on the ground in California on the issue. We then saw him boarding Air Force One, presumably not back in Washington yet.
Not back in Washington yet, indeed, but will nonetheless, it has full communications, obviously, aboard Air Force One, will be in very close contact with his Defense Secretary, his National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, assessing the situation and trying to coordinate a response, as well, of course, as trying to find the words to express the nation's total and utter shock and disbelief at what has happened here. The worst attack in history on the continental United States. The emblematic building, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, so symbolic of both New York City and of the United States and its global superpower status, destroyed. The Pentagon hit the very center of American military power.
Okay, James Mates live in Washington for the time being. Thanks very much. Do keep us posted. There we see now live pictures of the of the attacks in the United States on New York City. The World Trade Center has been attacked and destroyed by a terrorist attack. Now, we understand that the Duchess of York is in New York today. Her charity apparently has an office in one of the towers of the World Trade Center. She was due, according to her diary, to visit 2 of the workers there today. They have got out, we've been told, and the Duchess is also reported to be safe, although we don't know her whereabouts within New York at the moment. Now, we have some reaction from the streets of New York to this devastating attack.
What tower were you in, ma'am?
We're in the, what are we in, 3 World Financial Center. We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't let, everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go. And then I heard that another plane hit, and if you go over by there, you can see the people jumping out the window. They're jumping out the window right now. Oh my God.
All right. We're standing in front of the Soho Grand Hotel, and the doorman, I'm with the fire alarm company, the doorman goes to me, wow, I never seen a plane flying so low. And we looked out at it, all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real. And we came running over here closer to the place, and all of a sudden we saw the other explosion. I don't know.
Everything just went black. Everything came down, glass started popping. People got hurt, stuff went on top of them. And it was a big explosion, and everything got dark, real dark, like snow. You can see behind me, oh, this is not snow, this is all from the building. It was a terrible nightmare.
I was in B Tower.
B Tower?
A Tower.
What floor were you on?
B1.
What floor?
The first one.
What happened? Tell me.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Anything else that you saw? Were you there for the second hit by the plane?
About 10 minutes later, the second building went off.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it. It just blew up. A big explosion. People started running. It was just chaos everywhere. Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement. Came down. All of a sudden, the elevator blew up. Smoke. I dragged the guy out. His skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out of to the ambulance.
Shock, terror, confusion, and horror there. Eyewitness reaction from the streets of New York to the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. A double plane hijacking. The planes then crashed into the World Trade Center, the towers subsequently collapsing. A third attack on the Pentagon in Washington, the heart of the American military establishment, and a reported 4th attack in the industrial city of Pittsburgh. I should also say to you that those of you who are expecting normal programming on ITV1 will find that continuing on ITV2. Now, I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Rathmell, an analyst in terrorism from the RAND Corporation in Europe. Dr. Rathmell, we have talked about this, assuming that it is an attack by Arab terrorists. That is the natural reaction. This building was attacked before in 1993. But let's not forget the Oklahoma bombing. This, of course, was domestic. Is that a possibility?
Of course, it's a possibility because we have no evidence as yet, but it's very, very unlikely. The Oklahoma attack was a one-off. There were only a very small group of terrorists involved in that, one of whom has now been executed, Timothy McVeigh. So those groups have lost a lot of power, a lot of influence over the last few years, and there's no evidence that they have the capacity to mount this sort of operation. Let's just make sure, though, that we don't use the term Arab here, in the sense that the previous attack on the World Trade Center was carried out by Islamist groups, some of whom were Arab, but obviously not all of the members of these groups are Arabs. The motivation is political Islam in some cases rather than Arab nationalism. And we've
already seen one group claiming responsibility. Do you give that any credence? Naturally, in these events, you get lots and lots of different groups, splinter groups, trying to say that they did it.
And you get, in the first few hours, a lot of confusion because on the one side, that group, the Democratic Front, did appear to claim responsibility. A little later in the day it appeared to reject responsibility. That group, in fact, I think is a group which has carried out very few major terrorist attacks in the last few years. So it seems quite unlikely to have been seriously involved in this. And in fact, I would be quite surprised if any organised group really put its hand to its heart and said, we did this, because they'll be very vulnerable to retaliation.
There we are seeing now live pictures of the Pentagon still smoking some hours after the attack there. How will this have affected the United States' ability to deal with the immediate crisis and then, of course, the ongoing situation?
The immediate crisis, the attack on the Pentagon, obviously depending exactly where it hit, shouldn't cause too many problems because most of the agencies involved in immediate response and 24-hour response are local agencies or are coordinated by, for example, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, not necessarily out of the Pentagon. And indeed, many of the military activities that are now required won't need to be coordinated from the Pentagon. There are local activities. So in the short term, this shouldn't be too much of a problem. In the longer term, of course, the Pentagon and the American intelligence services will start planning on how to retaliate for this and how to catch those responsible. And again, depending on exactly who was killed in the Pentagon, what casualties there were, of course, that may have affected that capability.
And how will President Bush, was talking about James Mates in Washington about this, how will President Bush be dealing with this? We know he's one of the few planes flying over the United States at the moment, barring the military, in Air Force One. He's flying from California to get back to Washington as quickly as possible, we suppose. What kind of traffic is passing between Air Force One and the Pentagon right now?
Well, it'll be very busy traffic, but what I think may be concentrating the President's mind is that under his administration, one of the themes which they wanted to address was terrorism and what they've called homeland defence. How do they harden the homeland and then manage the consequences of these sorts of events? So they are developing a plan in the National Security Council for how to deal with this sort of activity.